Hey you, and welcome back to the channel. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been editing your videos and then sometimes you just start adding on some effects or maybe some text, color grading, and then all of a sudden it's like your computer just slows down, everything's just chugging, the fans start turning on? Well, me too. Luckily though, there's some things that you can do about that. I'm gonna show you in today's video how you can speed up your system and also your editing as well. Some of these are pretty obvious, so you may already know them if you're used to editing large files, but some of these other tips I haven't really heard too many people talking about, so you may not know about them, especially if you've just switched to Resolve. Now, one of the things that I have heard said a lot, which I haven't actually confirmed myself, but I think there's some truth to this, is that the studio version of Resolve runs just a little bit faster than the free version. So don't quote me on that, as I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure there is a slight difference. That being said, I was on the free version of Resolve when I started for a while, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The free version of Resolve is actually one of the best free version softwares out there. It's extremely well thought out, and you actually have access to pretty much all of the tools that you need, including for editing, color grading, and so on and so forth. You may be missing out on a few things like effects, but for the most part, you have everything there to get you started. Now, if you spend a lot of time editing, especially either for clients or doing professional work or even just for your own stuff and you're editing a lot, it really is worth considering the upgrade to the studio version. You get it with pretty much the purchase of like any Blackmagic product. So if you're thinking about updating your camera and buying a camera from them, like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera or equipment like the Speed Editor, for example, then you get the studio version of Resolve with that purchase. So the investment can also give you the studio version as well. So next, let's talk about your system. Video editing is really heavy resource-wise, so your experience is really gonna vary based on your system specs. So this point really is more so for people that are either looking to upgrade their system right now or looking into actually getting a PC or Mac specifically for video editing. Whether you're looking into getting into Mac or Windows, it's worth spending your money where it really counts. For example, the most updated versions of CPUs, your RAM, and then VRAM as well if it's a dedicated graphics card too, which I highly recommend. There are a few other considerations as well, and you want to make sure your computer has the proper input-output stuff and some other bells and whistles that can make your life easier. But for the most part, those things are going to get you the most bang for your buck when putting a system together. Right now, for example, I'm doing most of my work on an M1 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro, and so far that system has been really great for me. I mainly do video editing and color grading, and I've also dabbled around with some things like Unreal Engine, for example, but nothing too serious. And so far, the system's actually held up really well, and it's done everything I've needed it to do so far. Now, typically when people are buying new systems, I always recommend going with at least 16 gigs of RAM storage at least, because video editing is going to chew through that really fast. So start at 16 gigs minimum and then go up from there if you can. All right, so what about some practical things that we can actually do in Resolve? Well, first, let's look at your render cache settings and update those first. So when you're adding things like text or effects to your clip, the system's actually going to need to render out those clips in order to play back at real time. So if you go up to the playback menu and then go to render cache, you can update it to smart, which means it'll start rendering this portion of the timeline you're on and prioritize that render. This little bar will show up above your footage here in the editing timeline, and if it's blue, then that means it's rendered, and if not, it'll be red. Just as a side note, I've actually noticed that it does this with the color page as well, where your nodes will be highlighted either blue or red depending on if it's rendered out yet or not. Aside from that, you also have some render cache settings that you can change in your project settings too. So if you go down to the little gear icon near the bottom right of Resolve and then go to master settings, you can scroll down to the bottom, and here you'll find the optimize media and render cache section. Here you can choose the file type it'll render your footage in and after how long Resolve will start caching your files, as well as a few other options too. I have mine set to 422 proxy for the file type. That's usually a fast and light file type, and it's been working great so far on my system. If I go to the timeline here and put an effect on a clip, for example, like let's say a title, you'll see here it'll start rendering it above the clip. Once that's blue, I can hit the play button and it'll play the clip and the title back in real time. If you want to make sure it's playing back at the correct frame rate, you can also check up here above the player and it'll tell you if you're dropping any frames or playing back in real time. Like I mentioned, this also works on the color page as well. If I create a new node here and put an effect on it like a camera shake, for example, you'll see it's red there for a second until it renders out. Then it'll turn blue, letting you know that that node is rendered and cached. You can then play back your clip without stuttering since it's rendered out. Now, if you have the luxury of working on multiple hard drives or SSDs, for example, then this is another trick that you can use. A lot of people like to set their actual render cache location to a separate SSD when they're working, because that allows your main hard drive to stay free and clear to just run your operating software, and then you can have all the other files located somewhere else. This is especially helpful if you're working with really big files too. So if you go back into project settings in Resolve, you'll actually see this section for your working files. This includes proxies and your render cache too. You can set that to another hard drive so that way it's only dedicated to rendering your media, and that'll free up your main computer to just run the software. Same thing goes for proxies. If you're creating proxies to work from, then you can offload that to a hard drive, a different one, so that way it's not clogging up your main disk. So speaking of optimized medias and proxies, let's dive into that. First, what are proxies and optimized media? This is where you get Resolve to convert some of your files from really dense, heavy files that make it hard for your computer to work with into lighter, maybe smaller file types that you can easily edit through, especially if you're working with giant raw files or some codecs that are harder for your computer to process. Especially when you're trying to get through a lot of footage and edit your files, you may not necessarily need the 4K or 6K or however many Ks raw files that initially are provided to you straight from camera. Sometimes you just need something like a 1080p ProRes proxy file, which your computer can chew through a lot easier instead of having to actually go through and decode and play back all of the raw files and the raw file data. Luckily, you can dial in your precise settings project by project in project settings. So if we open that back up here, you'll see that you can choose here what type of proxy or optimized media you want. Mine are set to ProRes proxy files, which just means it's a smaller bitrate ProRes file. So there's not as much information contained in these files compared to the original or raw files. And I can also set the resolution here. So if I want to halve or quarter the resolution of these, I can choose that here as well. This can really help, especially if you don't need to pixel peep, for example, and say you're trying to get through and edit quite a bit of footage. This will help speed up your system. Now, don't worry, this doesn't mean you're downgrading your files. Instead, Resolve just creates a temporary file that it can work from and point to in order to make your workflow easier. Behind the scenes, you still have your full resolution raw files that will reflect all of your edits upon export. For example, if we go here to the deliver page and scroll down to the advanced settings, you'll see here you can force your sizing and debayering to the highest quality for raw files, but right above you'll see these options to use optimize or proxy media for your export. If those are unchecked, then it'll use your original raw files for your export, which is what you want, meaning you'll get a full resolution and bitrate files on export. On the cut page, if you click on this little camera on the playback screen, you'll see you have options to disable proxies, or prefer camera originals. That way, Resolve lets you work with whatever file type you want to look at. In the playback menu, you can also check use optimized media if available, and then you get the same proxy menu here a little bit below that. Now, to actually generate the proxies, you can go to your media pool and highlight all of your clips you want to generate optimized media or proxies of, and then right click on those. It'll give you an option here to either generate a proxy or optimize media. Resolve will then follow the preferences you've set in your project settings and generate these for you. Last tip, which can really help speed up your workflow here, is something called render in place. Now, if you've ever worked in a program like Premiere Pro, this is basically the equivalent of nesting your clip. What happens is sometimes clips can get a little bit more complex, and let's say you have either like a fusion composition or you have multiple things working like titles, color grades, effects, so on and so forth. That's going to usually take a really long time to render out every single time you come back to it in the timeline, especially if you're using something like Smart Cache, which is a really great thing to use, but on these denser files, when you move off of that in the timeline and then come back to it, it'll have to re-render that portion of the video. Render in place is actually really useful as well if, let's say, you're sending this edit to another person that is maybe working in a different system or whatever. Render in place really helps because we don't know how that system's going to interpret things like speed ramps or titles or so on and so forth. So what you can do is render in place the clip, and then it'll make sure to save all those settings and present the clip exactly how you wanted it from Resolve. Render in place will preserve all of that, and you don't have to worry about the interpretation between softwares because Resolve essentially creates a new clip on the timeline for you. So instead of waiting for it every time, you can just select all of the clips you want to render and right-click with them all selected. Then you'll hit this option here which says render in place, and this menu will appear. If this is a scratch file, just to get your ideas across, you can render this clip as a proxy, let's say. It won't be the highest quality, but it'll convey your ideas while preserving your effects and things like speed ramps, titles, color grade, and all of the things that usually don't translate well between programs. If you want something more high quality, then you can select the codec here and use it as a master file also. And you can also include your things like video effects and everything else in this clip as well. The cool thing about this option is that if you change your mind later, you can break up these clips again and decompose your rendered in place clip back to the original clips. Alright, so that's where I'm going to leave it for this video. Hopefully you learned some cool new tricks that you can use in your workflow to speed up your editing process. The cool thing is once you combine several of these tricks like using smart cache, generating optimized media or proxies, rendering in place and all that stuff, then you can really get through your edits a lot faster using these different tips. If you like this video or learned something useful, don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button down below. Share this video out with someone so that we can spread the good news. Thanks to everyone that stuck around until the end of the video and subscribed already. I really appreciate it and thank you for helping out the channel as well. Until next time though, go out there and create something. La Davinci.